Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices. Our hostess for today's program is Teresa Miller, Executive Director for the Oklahoma Center for Poets and Writers at OSU Tulsa.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is America's favorite poet, Billy Collins. Thank you for being here, Billy.
It's very nice to be here.
I've been getting all sorts of calls this week saying, is it true Billy's really coming? Not Billy Collins, but Billy. Do you feel sometimes that your poetry's put you on a first-name basis with most of America?
I chose my name rather willfully because when I first started getting published, I mean, if your name is William, you have lots of choices. But there is a romantic English poet, William Collins, who is not as well known as Wordsworth and others, but I thought in my youthful vanity that maybe one day I'd be in an anthology and I'd be with William Collins, or two William Collinses would be confusing. Well, it turns out that I have been in a few anthologies with William Collins, so I was right in my vanity, I guess. But I also, when I was younger, I had a number of misconceptions about poetry, and one of them is that you had to have a very fancy name, usually involving initials. So T.S. Eliot, for example, or something symmetrical like William Carlos Williams. No one had just a regular name. And I think when I started writing poetry that was less pretentious, I thought I would take on a very intentionally non-literary name. So maybe it's that, and maybe the fact that I try to write poems that are fairly intimate with the reader, that people are not calling me Professor Collins as they should.
In fact, some of your poems are actually addressed to the reader. Do you think that deepens the connection?
Well, I think I'm recovering again from some misconceptions I had about poetry. And I think I've read a lot of poems by other people where I feel kind of excluded. I don't feel like I'm being spoken to. I don't hear a voice talking to me. I see a pattern of language. I see a literary performance that I'm witnessing, but I'm not hearing a voice talking to me. And that's just in some poems. So I think I'm trying to compensate for that by talking directly to the reader and acknowledging that the reader is part of the communication, and that the poem is really not completed until it reaches the mind of a reader. Otherwise, it's just spinning in some little solipsistic vortex of your own ego.
At what stage in your life did you realize that you were a poet?
Well, I wanted to be a poet from a very early age, probably, early high school. And I think I was just enraptured and smitten by the image of the poet, which was a very romantic image of a kind of isolated, brooding artist, who was off in a shack or on a mountaintop. And I think it was probably a very adolescent infatuation I had with this kind of melodramatic image of a poet. But there was something under that, because I always liked to fool around with words. I liked to read poetry. My mother had memorized lots of poetry as a schoolgirl. And so that poems or sections of poems would burst from her mouth on just about to fit any occasion. So poetry was in the house as part of the atmosphere of the house. And I was fascinated with being able to put what happened when you read something and you found words going together that seemed to give off little sparks. Or you would stop in the middle of a poem or a sentence and just want to go back and reread that. Or you want to write that little phrase down somewhere to keep it. So I was, I think, aware at a fairly early age of these little bits of energy that language can give off. And I just kept at it.
Several years ago, I had the occasion to meet the great poet, a generation earlier than you, Howard Nemeroff. I got to visit with him a little bit, and he said that when he first became a poet, his family was very unsettled, particularly his father, even after he became a very accomplished poet. And it wasn't until he got an award that proclaimed him a man of letters that his father started to applaud his work. Were there any people in your family saying, you know, Billy, you might want to consider real estate, optometry?
Plastics, bathtubs, mattresses. I had an analogous experience. My father was from a fairly poor family in a kind of mill town in Massachusetts, from Lowell, Massachusetts, which happens to be Jack Kerouac's hometown. And my father and Jack Kerouac you couldn't find two more different people in the same room. But he worked his way up and became a kind of executive in an insurance company. And he was always curious about why I didn't take advantage of that and didn't go to business school. He never put a lot of pressure on me, but I think he just thought I was a wayward. I was not standing on his shoulders, but I was on a kind of lateral drift into something. Well, I didn't become a poet right away. I went to graduate school. I got a PhD in literature and began teaching college. So he was always proud of me as being a professor, right? The poetry he didn't quite understand. But analogous to Nemiroff's story, I admire Nemiroff's work greatly. He was also a poet laureate or consultant. I won a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, and I think it was $20,000 or $23,000. And when I told him that, he stopped in his tracks. It was for poetry, 25 figures for poetry, and there was a kind of a new respect. But in his language, it simply had to be presented with a decimal point. My mother had a finer understanding of what poetry was, but it was the same moment where you get respect by translating what you're doing into someone else's language.
Even people who will tell you they don't typically like poetry say they love your poems because of your wonderful sense of humor. I wonder if you would elaborate on something you said once, that humor is a door to the serious.
Well, humor had a long history in poetry, and I don't want to turn this into a lecture on the history of humor in literature. But if you go back to Roman comedies, you go back to Chaucer, who's hilarious, and Shakespeare obviously wrote comedies, and then you have Augustan satire. Humor had a very strong place in poetry until the Romantic poets came along in the early 19th century. And what happened then was that Wordsworth and Coleridge, primarily, Shelley and Keats, basically got rid of sex and humor and introduced landscape as a substitute. I would say a poor substitute. And humor had a very hard time recovering. Throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th, humorous poetry was called light verse. If you were funny, it meant you were trivial. Your poetry was mere entertainment. So poets like Ogden Nash, who was actually a terrific poet and a poet of great wit and intelligence, Nash and others were consigned to this little corner of light verse, and that's where humor was shunted off to. And I think it wasn't until maybe the 1950s or 60s, with poets like the New York School poets like Kenneth Koch and others, and in England, Philip Larkin, who had a very dark, barbed sense of humor, that humor started to come back. And humor in the best sense of the word, I think, as you were referring to, is not just humor in itself. The point of a poem that contains humor is not so much just to entertain you or make you laugh, but it is a way of almost disarming you or creating for reader and poet a kind of instantaneous common ground. Because if someone tells you a joke or makes you laugh through some witty comment, they have caused an actual involuntary reaction. It's a little like being able to make someone sneeze by pointing at them. Mm-hmm. You know, you don't have control over your humor reactions. And so if something is amusing, or in the beginning of a poem it's almost works to get the reader involved in the poem, and the reader becomes kind of committed at that point. And then the humor can drop out, as I think it often does, and the poem can be quite serious, can go from simple to confusing, from something that's clear and very clearly oriented to something that's very mysterious and insoluble. So I think humor really works best at the beginning of poems as really a kind of seductive device. And you could also say that humor is a way of looking at things. It's not just a desire to be funny. It's sort of an angle. It's hard. I think it's impossible to force yourself to be funny. But if you see things at this strange angle, then that's the way you see things, and that's the way you naturally write.
One of your poems that I think does a terrific job of combining wit and insight is Colorado. It's in your collection, 9 Horses. Would you read it for us, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's short enough, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's called Colorado. Is there any part of the devil's body that has not been used to name some feature of the American topography? I wondered when the guide directed our attention to the rocky tip of a mesa which was known as the Devil's Elbow. He was a college student just trying to do his summer job, and besides, the cumulus clouds were massing beautifully above the high rock face. So I was not about to say anything, but from my limited encounters with evil, it looked to me more like the hammer in the devil's inner ear.
I read that to a group I was speaking to the other night, a church group, by the way, and they just loved it.
Well, it's true. I mean, if you go around the American West, people will say they call that little outcropping, the devil's nose or the devil's earlobe or something.
Were you actually in Colorado when you wrote the poem?
Yeah, I was.
Is that usually the case with your poems, that you write them on the spot?
Sometimes it all happens later after you take notes or something strikes you. It just has to percolate for a while. Other times something begins and it just gets written down very, very quickly.
Is there a chance we might get an Oklahoma poem out of this visit?
Surely, yeah, absolutely.
When we pick up one of your collections, like 9 Horses, or your latest collection, The Trouble with Poetry, how important is it to us as readers to follow the sequence of the poems?
Oh, it's not important at all. I don't think anyone reads a book from front to back, book of poems anyway. Other books you'd have to. I think poets go through a great deal of anxiety and consternation about how they should order the poems. But in fact, no one really reads them like that from front to back, except maybe an editor would or a book reviewer might. Most people, if they're anything like me, open a book of poems and just start almost like a flip book. And you just find a kind of grabby title, or maybe I always look for a small poem just to give me a quick little sample, a teaspoonful of the poet's style. So there might be an arc to some books of poems, where it's really orchestrated symphonically, but mine are put together. I put mine together in a strange way. If I feel like I have enough poems for a book, I put them all out on the floor of the biggest room in the house, face up, naturally. It's not that mysterious. And I just walk around in my stocking feet, and I try to find 2 poems that just feel like being with each other. And it doesn't have they don't have a rational connection often. They're not both about nature or dogs or death or whatever, but they just sort of want to hang around with each other. And I'll keep going around trying to find other cousins who might want to join this little family reunion until I have a number of piles. I just keep working like that until I have maybe 4 piles, and I'll move them around and shuffle them a little bit more, and then suddenly they kind of fall into place as the sections of a book. But I'm not sure, if you asked me to explain exactly what was going through my mind, I was doing this, it's very intuitive. So I think it's actually kind of arbitrary. I do tell students or younger poets or poets who are trying to get published they often ask that question about how to organize a book. If you're sending a book to, this is just cheap advice, but if you're sending a book to an editor to be published, front load the book. Just put all the good poems right up front. If the book gets accepted, then you can always change the order later. But so there's two ways to do it, one for the editor and then one for the real book.
How do your recent poems compare to your earlier work, do you think?
Oh, worse. I'm not sure.
Hard question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. All these questions are hard. I think, it's like writing and talking about your work are such different activities.
Exactly.
And they take almost opposite sides of the brain. And my favorite analogy is that trying to get an author to talk about their reading, and this is what you do all the time, and do well, it's a little like if you've ever tried to get a dog to look in the mirror. You go, you're a little puppy, and you go, look at you, look in the mirror, look at yourself. They don't get it. They turn around and wonder why you're holding them like that. Parakeets will get interested in the mirror, but dogs have no interest. It's like looking at a blank wall, a brick wall. And I think it's like when you try to turn a writer's attention on their own writing, it's sort of like they have to turn into somebody else to do that. So I think my poems have gotten, better and worse in ways I find hard to describe. I'll think about it. Maybe we'll come back to that.
Okay, well, no, and I think you've answered it very well, as a matter of fact. Are you aware, though, of any recurring themes in your poems?
Well, the theme is me.
That's a pretty good theme.
Yeah, I'm the theme. And that goes back to how to organize a book. I mean, I don't do it by themes because I think I'm the theme, or my obsessions will come out in the book eventually. I suppose there are a lot of poems that are just about various things, various topics, like Colorado, like everyone calling every other mountaintop the devil, something or other. But if you look at the core poems, I imagine they're looking at life through the lens of death.
Exactly.
Tagore, the Bengali poet, said that we should look at life in the light of death, as if death shed a light on life and made it clear what it really is, transitory, and also illuminated it and italicized it. So it's really looking at life through this lens of death. And I suppose I fall into the most ancient theme in poetry, which is carpe diem, which is, the reason we are asked to carpe our diems is that we don't have an infinite number of diems left, so we need to seize the moment. And I guess besides that, italicizing life through that lens of death, I suppose that maybe the most common emotional thread is gratitude, and that is simply gratitude for being alive. In that sense, poetry, or some poetry, acts as a counterweight to balance out our presumptuousness about being alive. The fact that most of us, including me, much of the time, walk down the street taking it all for granted. This absolute, astounding miracle that we are here in this moment. And that is so easily forgotten. And I think poetry is one of the stronger services of poetry, is to remind you of that intensity of the moment.
Are there ever any topics you can't write about?
Oh, most of the things that really happen to me in everyday life, I don't write about, really. I just don't think they're any kind of personal things. I don't think they're really interesting to a reader. I'm trying to be, I suppose, more than just a single personality. I'm trying to write poems that are a little more philosophical, and that might talk about the little details of life, like the fern, and the orange on the table. But this could be your fern or your orange as well. So I think I wouldn't write about anything that just had to do with my own, psychic misery. I wouldn't presume that anyone would be interested in that.
shortly after 9/11, you read your poem, The Names, to a joint session of Congress. What sort of emotions were whirling in you as you wrote this poem about the people we lost that fateful day?
Well, the emotions that were whirling through me as I read it were just fear, because it was very disconcerting to actually read a poem before the entire joint session of Congress. When I wrote the poem, I really wasn't emotional at all. You don't really need to be emotional to write poems. You need to have an emotional life and an emotional understanding, but you need to concentrate on what you're doing. The best time to write for me is with a completely blank mind and a completely sort of blank heart, where I'm not thinking or feeling about much at all. That poem was for the victims of 9/11, or to commemorate the anniversary of 9/11, seemed like an impossible task. And I was then poet laureate, and that's why I was asked by Congress to write something and read it on that occasion. It was an interesting series of events, I think, because I got a phone call from the people at the kind of PR people at Congress. Congress has a public relations office. We shouldn't be surprised to hear.
It doesn't always work very well.
No, right, and they're probably kept very busy these days. But they asked me if I'd write a poem and read it, and I said, probably not. I said I would show up. I mean, you can't say to Congress you're not going to, you have something better to do. But I thought, that's not my kind of poem. The subject is too big. I mean, if you know my poems, they're about these, tiny little details of life, which turn out to be the big things anyway. But I've just never written a public poem like that, that would commemorate occasion, that would be addressed to a huge audience. My poems are a lot quieter and take place in more of a thimble-sized world. So I said I probably wouldn't write something. I'd think about it, but I'd find something to read. And I thought, there's got to be something in Whitman. I just thought, I'll read a lot of Whitman and I'll find something for the occasion. And then, I hope I'm not dragging the story out so long.
No, it's a compelling story.
But about 5 o'clock one morning, I kind of woke up a little earlier than usual, and it was kind of bugging me that I wasn't rising to the occasion by coming up with a poem. And I thought, well, okay, I could write an elegy, and it would be an elegy for the people who died that day. So that gave me a genre, I'll write an elegy, poem for the dead. And then I thought, I can use the alphabet. I can use the alphabet of the names of the deceased as a way to structure the poem. And we would kind of move through a set of images from one name to another, A to Z. Well, I got up and I wrote the poem in about an hour and a half, because I had these two things. I had the container of an elegy, which was the genre I could inhabit, and I had the alphabet, which was a set of handholds that would move me through the poem. At that point, it was very doable, and I kind of made up names, like in the beginning, Adonisio or Baker or Cooper. When I finally looked at the list of the dead, which is I got on the internet on CNN, I actually had guessed about a dozen of them, and then I wanted them all to be real, obviously, and it was kind of a mix of very common names and very unusual names. And the only letter that was not represented by a victim was X, and so I tried to solve that problem by putting it in parenthesis, and I said, let X stand, if it can, for all those not found. But it's an interesting little lesson, perhaps, in my complete inability to perform without having a kind of box to work within.
Then you had those wonderful closing lines. Can you recite those for us?
I think the last two lines were, so many names wheeled into the warehouse of the something, and there's so many names, there is not enough room on the walls of the heart. to inscribe them.
Wonderful closing lines. We had Jane Smiley on the show recently, and she said she wasn't able to write at all after 9/11. Dave Barry said something similar. How do you maintain your voice during dark times, not just in the aftermath of 9/11, but other down times in your life?
Well, I think what was true on September 10th was true on September 12th. I think there's a lot that doesn't change. As a period in history, we are like every other period in history, which thinks it's the craziest and the last and the most nutty and confused. And if you look back at history, I mean, what's going on in our world is completely typical. It's completely consonant with the events that characterize what we call history. Kurt Vonnegut says, "History, read it and weep." You know, it's like a bad poker hand. So I don't really. I think I try to pull back so that the events of the day, to me, do not seem frightening or certainly not unprecedented. I mean, history is basically a repetition. History is the misuse of time. I think that's a good definition of it. It's the way humans misuse time. And poetry tends to be about time, not about history.
We just have under a minute left here, Billy. I've got to ask you a question. A critic has said that Billy Collins' poems aren't about memorizing lines, they're about making us remember our own lives. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'd have to. That's a very nice thing for him to say, or her to say. Well, yeah, I mean, poetry is less memorizable now that my poetry, at least, is one of those that don't have regular rhyme and meter. But I'm trying to zero in on that moment again. It's like you can smash an atom and create all this energy, and you can actually smash a moment. If you isolate a moment in time, the way haiku does, you can release this tremendous amount of kind of spiritual energy.
Thank you for being with us, Billy, and thank all of you for joining us for part one of this two-part Writing Out Loud interview with Billy Collins.